Hi, I'm Austin Wintory, and this is the Game Maker's Notebook. I have a great pleasure this time of chatting with Lennie Moore, and this one comes as a bit of a personally gratifying episode because Lenny was right there at the beginning of my own career when I was studying at USC 20 years ago, and he was one of my very formative teachers. He is very well known for the music of the original Outcast from 1999, and now this year, its sequel, 25 years later. So we talk a lot about his work on that franchise, his journey into games. We get a lot into the business side of the industry, which was actually really wonderful to do and able to kind of shed some light on a topic that gets criminally underexplored. And also the role and importance of mentors in our career, which I'm grateful to call Lenny one of my early mentors. So I think it was a great chat, and I hope you enjoy. All righty, Lennie Moore. This feels like a long time coming.
I know, man.
This is you're. I think of you as my contact point with this industry on a professional. I was a fan solely until basically I met you, and then you were holding my hand at the time of transition. So this is very exciting.
Okay, define holding your hand at time of transition. There was we met in a particular setting, which was more, I suppose, educational.
Very much so. You gave me newfound appreciation for Guy Whitmore's "No One Lives Forever," among many other things.
Classic.
Yeah. No, absolutely. There's so much we can get into, but I suppose. Yeah.
So shout out to Guy. We'll start with that.
Absolutely. Love that. No One Lives Forever is not a game that comes up as often as it probably should in conversation. At least adaptive music wise.
Right.
But in any case, why don't we just do a few kind of almost housekeeping kind of things and
sure.
For our uninitiated listeners, bring us up to speed on how you kind of managed to get into games and music. And I think of you as such a jazz musician at so much of your heart and soul that
Daddy made a big band album.
Yeah, absolutely. Plus the May It Rest in Peace Dirty Harry stuff that you wrote was so awesome. So ingrained. It's funny how there's certain things to this day when I go to work with like an electric bass, I will still hear in my head how you did that. And it's sort of one of the things that I measure what I'm doing against through this, 12 or 13 or 15-year-old memory of what I heard. Sure. It's really kind of mythologized in my head. So yes, why don't you just give me the kind of, what got you into music growing up and what led you to game music? Because actually, I think there's big swaths of this. I don't know.
Okay, well let's inform you a bit. Please do. I grew up in. I was born in Central California, but when I was 7, we moved up to the Seattle area. So I lived up in a little place called Everett, Washington, and all the way through high school. And from early age, I was playing brass instruments really early on. So elementary school, I was playing trumpet. And junior high, I was playing baritone horn, which is awesome. And then went to trombone as well to play in the jazz band there. And then when I got to high school, I was playing trombone, but I also started playing electric bass. And there was a jazz choir that the music director for the whole district was doing in the high school. And this is around the time that we're talking the 1970s. So this is like Singers Unlimited and Manhattan Transfer, things like that. And so I was playing electric bass in that group and just falling in love with, rock and jazz and funk at the same time. And then on top of that, I was always writing from a really early age. I think I always joke that I got serious when I was 11. And I started writing.
Pretty similar story here. So
Yeah.
Why? Yeah.
I
No,
just
no, no shade
started
thrown at
writing
that.
jazz charts, started writing jazz charts and like arrangements for similar to Gordy. Uh, uh, is it Hob or
It's so
Hab?
funny. I waffled for years, and he told
It's
me
Hab, isn't
he
it? Yeah.
he finally
Yeah. Yeah.
cleared the air on that one as Hab.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, got it. It's Gordy. so,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
uh,
Gordy H.
so yeah, his whole thing about like doing arrangements for the band director and stuff like that. He did a lot of that.
Mm-hmm.
Fun little stories. I think I was a sophomore in high school, and there was a contest to do a marching band arrangement of the Libby's canned vegetable company. So this is a company, and it was like a logo. There was a commercial piece of music song that was all the Libby's
Wow.
things. It's just like, uh, and so I
That's
did
so
like
funny.
I did a weird Count Basie version of this commercial song, and ended up getting third place nationally in that. And it was just sort of a fun, goofy
Does this just
thing
mean
that I
that they
did.
sponsored this competition and wanted to use their
Yeah.
jingle as the foundation for it, basically?
Exactly. And it was like, I think third place, I got a little $500 prize. And that year, my high school band was doing like an East Coast tour, and we were just traveling all over the East Coast and checking things out. And it actually like helped fund, an airplane ticket.
You were
and stuff
flinging
like that.
20s at everyone you met.
Actually, I had my
rolling in
sister
it.
who wanted to go. So,
Yeah, that's funny.
like she wanted to go. Our family was like kind of tight on cash around that time. So like winning that prize helped get her there. So
Love
that was
that.
sort of a fun thing. But there
But it's
was
also
in
probably
this,
one of those crucial validation moments of, oh, I'm not bad at this.
there was that. But the other part was, and this is sort of like, I don't know how many of us go through this. I never had an imposter syndrome thing, but I felt like an alien in high school. I felt like I was the weird
Mm.
kid that was writing big band charts in the back of the room. And there's these really cool art workshops. And there was a composition workshop called Centrum in Port Townsend, Washington. And I think I was 15 or 16. It was the first time I had gone. I went there for a couple of years during high school. And, after feeling like I was the weird kid, I show up and there's like 100 kids taking this composition and performance workshops. And they were equally as weird as me or weirder. And I was like, okay, I found my people, and learned a lot. I mean, it was my first exposure at 16 to graphic notation. The professor who was doing the more traditional composition, I only remember his name is Don. He whipped out Threnody to the Victims of Hiroshima by Penderecki, and he also whipped out George Crumb, Mikrokosmos, the section where it's in a circle.
Yep.
And for
Classic.
those that want a little bit of info as far as writing music for games, I always tell students that when we're doing game audio is that you're composing a circle. And it was
Yeah.
just, it made it so easy for me to think of looping or any sort of repetitive kind of procedural kind of a thing
And the idea that there
just
might
think
be a
of it in a circle.
system that the composer is equal parts composer in the traditional sense and
Yes.
author of some kind of instruction kit to a mechanism that can kind of drive where it's like you're writing an algorithm in addition to the guts that the algorithm is assembling and disassembling.
Yeah, and on top of that, so the George Crumb solution is to take a push pin and shove it in the piece of paper and put it up on the wall and just spin it so that you could play the piece. So that his system involved a push pin. So Centrum was really influential for me as far as exposing me to a lot of things I had never been exposed to, and exposing me to a community of people. And
what was your interest in the kind of orchestral palette or the broader world of this sort of thing? Because if you're very much doing big band and funk and things like that up to that point, did this feel like an expansion of that or a lateral move into something totally new and different?
It was, it's interesting. I didn't get into orchestral writing like in depth until I was out of college. I was doing a lot of jazz stuff, small group, large group. But what it did do, that exposure to like orchestral music, I'd played it as a brass player in high school, tons of classical music and all that.
Right.
But I think the thing that it influenced me on was, like in my own writing, whether it was writing a song or writing like some jazz piece, was that like the idea of graphic notation being a method to experiment and try weird ideas. And so like some of my big band arrangements have some really weird things in them that are more graphic notation, including by the time I got to Berklee College of Music, which was my college that I went to, in one of my recitals, we did 4 minutes and 32 seconds by Cage for big band, which was awesome. And, the most awesome part is the whole idea of that sort of piece is what the audience does.
Yeah.
And so I had a drum solo, so to speak, in the middle of that 432. And the drummer was sort of like flailing and trying not to hit the drums, and he accidentally hit a cymbal, and the whole audience gasped and then just kind of, started giggling. And,
that is the piece.
Yeah, that's the piece. And I had that particular performance. I had a recording of that piece, and it makes me giggle every time because it's just like part of that experimentation of it. So yeah.
I wonder what the largest ensemble to ever do 433 is. If there's like a Mahler orchestra that has committed the resources.
Yeah, but you gotta have the Wagner tubin.
Yeah, exactly, and the hammer. That's
the anvils have to be there.
Exactly, it's like the most expensive silence of all time.
Yes, and at least stereotypos or something. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's part of it. So high school was just a lot of that. I got into Berklee, and I should mention that as far as a formative thing. So in those Centrum workshops, there was one summer workshop that I did, and the guest artist in residence was Toshiko Akiyoshi, who was a very famous jazz big band arranger and composer in the 1970s, probably mid to late 70s. And only 3 people signed up for this workshop with her. So it was a lot of one-on-one. And there was this one day where she basically said, "It's really sunny out. Let's go outside. Bring your scores." And the whole point of the 2 weeks in the summer was we brought a big band chart to work on, and we were going to refine it. And then like 2 weeks later, we're going to get it performed by a professional big band at part of the festival, of the performing festival. And so Toshika's looking at my score, and she's like pointing at a particular bar and saying, "Why did you do this?" And it was something in the sax section. And I was just like, classic 16-year-old going, "I don't know. I have no idea." And she's like, no, really. Why is that there? And I was like, "I don't know. I like it." And she's like, "Good enough." And her whole thing was that there has to be a reason why something's on a page. And then in the editing process, after you put it on the page, you revise, as far as revisions, you have to answer that question again. Why is it still going to be there? And she called it intentionality. And on my big band album, the last tune is dedicated to her, and it's called Intentionality. And it's a really important formative thing for me as a composer, which was that there's always an intention as to why you put something on the page and why it stays there after you've been listening to it a few times and analyzed it and kind of said, is this how I want to express what I want to express? So yeah, through high school, important. That was sort of formative stuff, and love being inspired by folks like that. And then got to Berklee College of Music, did a 4-year degree there and studied with a lot of awesome people. And, and
at that point,
so it was still big man. Yeah.
Well, you may have actually just answered the question I was about to ask. It's curious.
Well, ask it anyway.
Age, at that stage, what would you have described your professional ambition to be? Because I'm assuming working on video games would not have fallen off the tip of your tongue at that point. So the question is, what did you see yourself doing in the future at that stage?
Yeah. So, perspective wise for everybody historically, I had played some video games around the time I was in college because I had a really dear friend of mine who was a computer programmer who like got one of the first IBM PCs, and he brought it to our house, shoved it on the middle of the living room floor, and was showing us, some sprites that he made and stuff like that. And like one of the first games I ever played was called Empire. And it was basically on the University of Washington server or something like that. And it was just like, ASCII characters, and it's basically like Risk.
Right.
And you sort of move your little ships around and build your fleet and all that kind of thing. So I always had an early love for video games, but at that time it was definitely tone generators and coding. And so I didn't really make the leap then. It was more the idea that I wanted when I got out of Berkeley was I wanted to be a record producer. I wanted to be sort of a Gil Evans kind of jazz arranger guy, and that's what I thought I was going to be. And I also had a really diverse skill set because I'd been writing music the whole time, and I was doing all that stuff by hand. My music preparation skills and all that kind of stuff were solid, and I was really stinking fast at all that kind of stuff. And so it started with that, but I had a little bit of taste of different things because one of the guys I did a directed study, which is more like a private lesson with, was an arranger named Bob Friedman, who was in New York, and he did a lot of Broadway shows and things like that. So we kind of got into how to write for harp, how to write for strings. And he gave me a really great starting advice, which is like, if you write something musical, it's probably playable. And, that kind of got me into that. And then, so Berkeley, I got out of Berkeley, I came out, my grandmother lived in Vegas, and I was thinking, hey, there's a bunch of arrangers in Vegas, maybe that'll work, and I could play electric bass. And I get there, and about a month after I get there, there's a strike with all the musicians, and nothing was going on for 6 months. So I decided to kind of thinking along the producer lines. I'm like, what I didn't get in my college experience was business oriented stuff. So I spent like 2 to 3 years actually working for Domino's Pizza as a supervisor and a manager, and learning about personnel management, learning about budgeting and profit and loss statements and marketing and all the kinds of things you do to build a small business, which was
I
invaluable.
definitely didn't know about that.
Yeah, and I can still make a pepperoni pizza in about a minute. So, that part is, it's kind of like motor memory. Like when you learn to play the violin really deftly, the 1 minute pepperoni is one of those things.
That's so funny.
Yeah, it is. And so, and then
it's so valuable though. I just to underscore that, since I know that sometimes this gets listened to by composers kind of at the earlier stages.
Sure.
It is amazing how criminally undervalued, even still, the idea of learning the ins and outs of essentially running a small business, because that is what you are as a composer. You're the CEO and the CFO, and you're the president, and you're the manager,
the
and
marketing,
you're the janitor, and you're the marketing person, and you're everything. You have to do it all. And people, I've never understood also. It's because it seems like you actually took that initiative and really said, "Oh, I should learn this stuff." And I've always kind of come from a similar mindset. I think it's fascinating, and I think it ends up being very hand in glove with the creative part, because you start saying, "Okay, well, if we can only afford X, what can we get with X?" And now that's a creative discussion already, instantly, one sentence in. But there seems to be that notion of, well, no, the artist types should kind of hold that at arm's length. Let someone else take care of that. Your job is to go off and be creative. And that, to me, that's always felt like you're leaving important discussions out to someone else. I've never understood. Sounds like you're coming from a similar mindset.
Totally, Austin. The even this also applies to contracts. So I probably know more than most lawyers about composer contracts.
Exactly.
and it's kind of shown itself over the years in many cases. And so like,
and there's no downside to learning that. It's not like you cost you something that others gained in an opportunity cost kind of sense. It's just value add.
Yeah, and what's clear is because a lot of times, and this is for these emerging composers that haven't really heard much about this aspect of it. Um, like as far as contractual stuff, there's like the easiest way I can describe it is if you have at least 3 to 5 things that are your go-to things that you definitely want to have in a contract. One is like, am I getting paid? When am I getting paid? Credits. Um, my favorite one is who is God, and who is God is who is the person that approves all of my cues. Because if it just says the company will approve my cues, that could be 50 to 100 people,
Right.
for all I know. And therefore you could be rewriting for no reason, because you're getting conflicting feedback and things like that. So the who is God clause is critical. And so there's things like that.
I had that bite me in the ass not long ago. I had a project where my person who I thought was God turned out to be but one vote in a straight up, like a kind of worker co-op situation where there was a sort of straight up democratic vote system amongst the leadership of this company. And I had no contact with 80% of them. And so votes were being done about my work, but then channeled through this person, and then it kind of exploded, and I didn't see it coming because I had no idea that the power was more diffused than the person I was talking to. It was never expressed.
I would imagine nobody told you.
Not in a way that I
knew, you tracked it.
I knew enough that they thought I could see why they thought they told me that. I could see why from their angle they explained it in a way that I should know, but I don't know. I did not know that the machine was operating the way that it was until it was kind of on fire. And so, that's a great, so are you saying that you actually try to contractually sort of specify that so that it's sort of known by all parties, or is it more of I just go into it to know who has the actual power?
No. It's in the contract. It's in the contract.
I don't think
Yeah, it's just a clause. It's like approvals, who does approvals, who approves the work. And it doesn't have to be anything complicated as far as language. The things that I've seen, we could definitely go down a legal rabbit hole if we wanted to. But, the definitely things that I've seen lately have been things along the lines of, the approval's not clear. So I just want to clarify it. I'm like, who's the person? Because if it just says company will approve my stuff, that's a little, ambiguous. And I prefer if there was a human attached to it, and or at least there was some way of wording it that the company representative, and that representative would be the audio director or the producer or somebody like that. As long as there's a single person, even if there's a bunch of people that are on a committee. As long as there's one person to tell me and distill what the committee was talking about and distill it down to, this is what we want to see, where there's some sort of agreement in the committee of what they want me to do, then it just makes everybody work a little more efficiently. And, so there's that. The other thing
and expectations are everything with that sort of thing as well. Like you actually frame it from the starting point. It arms it for success a lot more successfully because it's, I see this mantle of responsibility is now on my shoulders. There's no chance of a kind of out of sight, out of mind, untended to stove burner kind of situation that can happen on their end of it.
Yeah, and in general, contractual stuff like this, a lot of times, the key things that I've noticed over the years are even though I know all these things, and sometimes I'll even suggest legal language, based on my experience over the years of what seems fair. The things that I think are good takeaways for anybody that's emerging and wanting to find out a little more about some of this stuff is, that the negotiation is not an adversarial thing. It can sometimes be that way, but these people wanted to hire me in the first place, so we're friends and we're just trying to have the business people do what they do. And so I usually never negotiate my own contracts. My agent takes care of that stuff, but I advise my agent as far as the stuff that I see in the contract that I think is problematic, and then they will push back and make suggestions, and then the business people will talk, because the business people tend to not respect the artists. They think you're the creative, and this kind of goes back to something you said earlier, that people sometimes put us in a box of, oh, they're the creative, they just do this one little tiny little thing in the corner here. But it really is, a diverse skill set that we have as content creators for media. So knowing a little bit about the business stuff, and to kind of, step away from contractual stuff, but just other business things like budgeting or personnel management. The budgeting thing is like classic. Like, you have a set amount that you get to work with for your budget, for your production budget. The other contractual thing I should kind of float back to is, I always separate my composer fee from my music production budget, because I think composers and the skill that we have is worth something. It has a value. So
Sure.
I always separate it out. Even if they say, hey, it's a package and it's X dollars, we're like, okay,
sure.
it's X dollars. You can call it what you want, but I'm not calling it a package. I'm saying, this is out of that X dollars, this is my fee, this is my production budget. And that's what we're approving.
I do a very similar thing.
Yeah.
Yep. No, I agree. I think it's very valuable to communicate to them also, so they understand the generalities of the hard costs associated with these things. You're showing them, here's what I think my time is worth. But also, if you want to go record a funk band, or if you want to go record the London Symphony,
or a funk orchestra,
or a funk London Symphony, those things exist on a pretty wide spectrum of costs, and it's good to get a sense that there's no downside to them having a bit of an understanding of that. Even if ultimately it's a package where it's all on you to go solve those problems.
Sure. Yeah. And a lot of times, that is a thing. The clients tend to want to give a package out to composers because they don't know how to hire an orchestra. They don't know how to corral all the things that we have to put together. So with that, we, we can be super helpful, and take
100%.
that stress off of the client where they're worried about the music. I don't want them to worry about the music. I want to let them know it's handled. And it's just more distinguishing those sort of differences of, there's a production budget. There's my fee for all the effort and the time that I put into what I do. And, so that's one component of it. The other thing that's on the personnel management side is, and this is also budget related, is like, if you're doing like a union session or something like that. One example is, if you're doing a union thing in the United States, if you hire a timpani player and he's playing timpani and you ask him to play a triangle, it's now 50% more.
Right.
And, so if
my favorite is when you hire a flute player and they go, what do you think about this on alto? And then they play it and you go, I still prefer it on C flute. And then you get the slip that says, I played a double. And I'm like,
right.
Really?
Yes. That doesn't happen very often, but it has happened.
Most of them, I don't mean to paint them as bad faith actors. I just mean that the union rules are very precise. And the more you know about them going in, again, the irony being that 99% of video game work is none of this is going to come up. Hopefully this changes. We start to see a tide shift.
I hope so.
There.
In the past, I've been a big advocate for just getting people at a table to hash out stuff. And
it's amazing how even that has proven to be a bit of a tooth pulling exercise in some cases.
Yeah, I think some of that is, it's weird. The union leadership in the United States and the musicians union is, for some reason, they think we're the enemy, and it's a dumb thing because we're collaborators, and the musicians that play on all of our projects are our best friends, and we love them, and we love what they bring in that collaboration to our projects. So that's
happily the worst of that is in the prior national level administration. I think the worst of that went away. Hopefully, we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. But, it's just it's funny because they just do really weird things sometimes, and we're just like, I'm just shaking my head going, okay. Cause like London is also unionized, but they have a thing. You have a beer with the shop steward. You say you follow the rules and they're like, fine, and so it's a,
Yeah.
different kind of business model. So outside of that stuff, this personal management, a budget, and, so like being mindful of what things cost, that's helpful, I think, because you don't want to get surprised, in the end, like you were describing.
So, and to put all that's absolute gold, and to put it back on our kind of timeline, you learned all that from Domino's or Pizza Hut.
It was Domino's, and
Domino's,
I learned that and other things.
Domino's was all about the triangle 50% up fee for the delivery drivers, and no, but I love it. I love that you have an interest in that. We could do an entire thing about that, but I would love to. My sort of OCD wants to at least get the timeline up to the point where your career then intersects with games, because obviously all this is great, and I don't want to dismiss it. It's just
it
like
was
I said,
all
almost an OCD impulse.
It's all foundational stuff that helped me do what I do professionally in games and in film and media and stuff like that. So after college and after that strike, and the Domino's Pizza stint, through Domino's Pizza, I ended up moving into California and got to LA eventually, and started playing in bands. And I was doing like horn section arrangements for this one particular band. And one of the background singers, her husband was a TV composer, and he needed an orchestrator, and it just kind of went to that. And then, so I started orchestrating for different composers for television and film, and conducting, and started doing my own composition for film, did a ton of commercials, all the different kinds of media. And then 25 years ago, there was a notice on a news group, which is like the equivalent of, like, I guess, a Discord server these days.
Forum or something. Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's like a little forum. And they said it was a post by this Belgian game company called Appeal. And they said, hey, we're looking for a Hollywood composer to score an orchestral score for our video game. And I just sort of raised my hand, sent them a note saying, I'm into doing this. And they sent them a demo. And out of whoever like demoed for that thing, my demo stuff included a bunch of live orchestra and choir that was like, stuff I had done on film and media projects. And so I think that was part of it. It was a real group, and that's what they were looking for. And they knew I had relationship with orchestras already. So that was the original Outcast in 1999 was when that shipped. And the thing that's crazy is it's been 25 years of being in the game industry and loving it and falling in love with, in the same way that I fell in love with this idea of George Crumb's circular kind of music. When they said we need the music to loop, I knew exactly what to do. And, I just thought of it that way. And that seemed like a very logical way of approaching those kinds of things. And I love puzzles. So, and half my friends are either like rocket scientists, game developers, programmers, or they're jazz musicians, so it's like, it's either musicians or like scientists types.
Well, and jazz musicians have a fairly high propensity to the kind of nerdy side of it. There's a lot of very cerebral folks, despite being such an emotional and instinct led musical subset, like, for example, far more instinct driven than traditional like string players in an orchestra, who are all about meticulous, sort of fine tuning of muscle memory. The jazz world is so much, you master that so that you can let go. And but it's funny how that still translates to, pound for pound, if I take 10 random musicians from different walks of life and I want to talk about theoretical physics with them, it's going to be the jazz musicians that are most likely going to want to jump to that topic, which has always been fun. Yeah, totally. They're like the 3 a.m. smoky den types also, Oh,
yeah, totally. So like, as an example, my brother Phil is a great saxophone player, bari sax player, but his master's is in physics, specifically lasers.
That's hilarious.
And
wow.
So, optics and stuff like that. So, but he's like funny about it, because it's like, if you ask him anything scientific, he's like, I don't remember that. Because he spent years he spent years following that path, but then he just wanted to play music. So he works with me on the music prep side, and as also as a player, and he's doing a lot of musical theater in Los Angeles, and he's session work and things like that. So he's like one example of this sort of blend. The other one is my friend Andy Suzuki. He's an amazing jazz saxophone player. He does calculus for fun in his head while he's talking to people in like a casual conversation. It's just like he's multitasking, and it's just like he was in Mensa for a minute and stuff like that. So he's a really brilliant, really brilliant person. But it's this blend of science. And then we would always hang out when I was living in Los Angeles as a younger musician. We would like always be hanging out in the dining room with our friends, just exactly like you're describing. My friend Kenny Lassane, who's a guitarist, would be like talking about the fall of the Roman Empire and just going deep,
I have a friend who's a science filmmaker who invited me once to a physicist conference.
Awesome.
And it was amazing because there were some major heavy, literally 1 week before it, one of the speakers had just won the Pulitzer,
right.
And the Nobel Prize, I'm sorry.
Sure.
And so it was a lot of really big, like NASA and JPL and CERN and Fermilab. And I was talking to this one guy and he said, "Oh, so you're the musician." So that someone had heard that there was an imposter in the group. And I said, "Oh, you're the composer. I heard there was going to be someone like that." Or he says, "Yeah, I'm a pianist." And he says, "There's actually a group of us from JPL or whatever that kind of play as an orchestra sometime, kind of a physicist orchestra, kind of like there's the Doctor Symphony and things like that." And he said, "Yeah, there's sort of a physicist." And I said, "Oh, really? You play piano?" He says, "Oh, well, sometimes we'll do like a concerto or something." And they'll ask me to play with them. I said, "Oh, really? What recently?" He says, "Oh, well, we recently did the second Rachmaninoff piano concerto." I was like, "Oh, so you're this high level physicist who can handle absolute world class repertoire."
Yeah.
It was so funny that's a side gig, just for fun.
How basically. Big were his hands? Because Rachmaninoffs were covered like an octave and a fifth, right?
Yeah, exactly. Famously, I imagine not quite that size, but but it's a funny phenomenon.
Yeah.
Sure. So Outcast was. I didn't actually realize that Outcast was kind of your first real up at bat in games, which is astounding because to this day, obviously, as evidenced by the fact that a sequel just came out, driven by that groundswell of perpetual kind of grassroots support, that game. I remember when I was your student, just a few years after you did that score,
right.
Like I think 04 or something like that. Was
so
when we would have crossed paths. Yeah. So that there were a lot of things that spoke to me on a personal level about it. First off, I one of the first people I had met when I came to LA was John Morgan and Bill Stromberg.
That's so great.
And so to see Bill in particular as part of your crew, and I think again on the sequel, I think I saw his name in the credits.
Bill
chipping in there.
Yep.
Which
Bill orchestrated a couple of cues.
I love that. I think of Bill as a like everyone. I always tell composers when I'm speaking to like the USC class, I'll come in and visit and say, I always say, make sure that you are an interesting person outside of work. And he's often one of the people I go to where I go, this guy is all but a professional storm chaser who's out there photographing tornadoes and stuff.
Yes, totally. Him and his wife. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that.
And there's the thing. So like, definitely check it. So he got professionally, he goes by William T. Stromberg, as far as his film scores that he did. But Bill Stromberg and John Morgan, just for the uninitiated, are a national treasure for film music restoration. They put out dozens of albums of reconstructions of classic film scores, everything from Max Steiner's King Kong from the 1930s, awesome Fahrenheit 451 recordings, Bernard Herrmann, and just a ton of stuff like that.
And thankless work. I remember once going over to John's house. This was shortly after I moved. This is 20 years ago almost. And he showed me the state of the sketch that he had to work from, where he goes, all that exists is the movie and this 6-line short score. And the parts are lost. So he's literally trying to listen through the dialogue and go, okay, yeah, that's clarinet 3, but also knowing what I know of Max Steiner or of Korngold or whomever. It's a level of musicology academia that is easy to just, you go, oh yeah, they reconstructed King Kong. Isn't that cool? And it's like, there's like 10 people on the planet that are capable of the level of work and delivering it at that level where it's, you listen to it and you go, if only Max Steiner could hear how this sounds today. This is amazing.
Yeah. And full disclosure, I worked on the Max Steiner King Kong project with them on one cue. And it was, if anybody knows that movie, it's the King Kong in New York in the theater scene. And it was one of those things, there was no existing written music of it at all. There was a recording I had from the laser disc. Yeah, pure takedown. So like my ear training is real high level, and same with John and same with Bill. And so basically what I had to do was I had to listen to an audio recording from a laser disc, which was pre-Blu-ray and all that, of the audio track from the movie and filter out the walla, filter out all the dialogue, filter out any sound effect stuff, and hear this theater orchestra. I knew what the instrumentation was because John knew. And, and then I just knew
some options off the table.
There was like a certain number of saxophones, and, and all that. And I just, the classic thing in that time period where like saxophones were with the orchestra. And so I just transcribed it. And
now, if memory serves, a cool bit of trivia that made me very happy. I did not know you worked on that particular recording with them, but I loved that when Peter Jackson made his version of King Kong, and we get to the scene in New York, and there's this footage of Howard Shore conducting a pit orchestra. They actually licensed that King Kong recording to feature as like a little Easter egg. Max Steiner King Kong music is actually being conducted, quote unquote, by Howard Shore before he breaks loose and stomps and kills them all as he's escaping the theater. I thought that was such a cool little feature. I remember seeing them share, hey, our recording, like in Moscow, I think, right? It was done in
Moscow Symphony Orchestra. Yeah. And
which is also who had recorded the original.
Here's the great thing. Right? I didn't even know that happened in that film. I didn't know about that, using that arrangement. So which is fun. So hopefully the Steiner estate got a little money from,
I imagine so,
from the film, and good for them, because it's worth preserving that kind of stuff. And that's just, I love little like callbacks to things like that.
I also feel like it speaks well to Peter Jackson that either he had the kind of, because he does come across as a bit of a kind of history buff, cinephile. He would be the guy that would recognize there's this great re-recording, reconstruction but at minimum, someone who had his ear knew about it. And that I like those moments where people kind of close the loop in nice little ways.
Yeah. And I love nerdy directors, so like, to me, Del Toro is one of those, and obviously Martin Scorsese.
Absolutely.
It's just, that understanding the history and all the details of things and stuff like that. So Guillermo del Toro is great. I think his focus is more on like special effects and models and visual language and things like that, but also just symbolism and all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
But, I love seeing things like that. So I totally appreciate that from Peter Jackson. Outcast was the first one.
Yeah. And that was wasn't that also Moscow? Like, because I remember it was a big, grand, lush recording. It really, especially at the time, stood out in that regard. I think that's a big part of why, to this day, there's this kind of almost cult following. I will see it on YouTube comments. I'll do like a podcast where we talk about some of our favorite scores, and it'll be like,
right.
name some of your favorites in the comments below, blah, blah, blah. And
Right.
it shows up. I see it.
Yes.
Lennie Moore's Outcast will appear because, if you were a gamer at that time and had your, ear to the ground and came across that game, the score really stood out as a rare one that not just fully produced, but it's really, real writing. You know what I mean? Like, you actually really gave the musicians something to do, meaningful and purposefully to echo your nice out in the
the intentional
sunny outdoor sunny outdoor private lesson. There's a real,
totally.
You really feel that.
Yeah, I hear you. I really appreciate that kind of love from people. It was one of the early full orchestral scores. It was an 80-piece orchestra and a choir, and it was, we recorded the choir live with the orchestra when we had the choir days, if I recall. We may have we might have overdone them. I think we recorded them live, if I recall, because I like the energy of the choir being in the room.
Of course.
But yeah, it was one of those things where I think one of the reasons it kind of is held up is, one of the beautiful things in scoring for games is just one of the reasons I love doing this kind of work is a lot of times the schedules are not as nutty as sometimes they are in film, where it's like, hey, we tossed out the score, so you have 2 weeks to do 90 minutes of music, go. Yeah. So, it's
Peter
like, I think
Jackson's
I had 6 months.
King Kong was literally a month to write 3 hours of score, which ironically is similar to what Max Steiner went through on Gone with the Wind, apparently, about 3 hours of music or whatever in a month. We don't have that so much.
But the distinction, I think, between Steiner and what we're dealing with these days as modern composers is Steiner would sit at a piano, he'd write a composer sketch, and then it would go to a whole music department. The orchestrations would be done. There's a whole team of people that the studio was, paying for to give the composer the ability to be able to do that kind of work. These days, you pretty much have to have a giant team in order to make that happen, and then you have to kind of have your team members do specialized kinds of things. Like if I was doing something like that, it would be, if they need demos, I have to probably hire people to do the demos because I can write way faster if I sketch it out. And, or if I just need somebody to do drum programming or something like that. And so, you have to think about back to personnel management. You have to manage like the scope of the schedule and what you have to do.
And also the question of how is your time best spent? Like, if they're paying for you to be the keeper of the vision, is it worth it for you to spend 6 hours futzing with an EQ on that particular synth patch? If time is short, if you have the time to do it all, great. If you don't, though, I definitely believe that there needs to be an assessment of opportunity costs that happened there, because you're a manager of sorts at that point.
And for those of us that are like uber meticulous, that's a tough one to go through. Like anybody with OCD or any of that kind of stuff. It's tough to let go of that kind of stuff. But the thing I always like to suggest is, what is it that you absolutely love doing every day? Do that and find people who love doing all that other stuff, and that's your team. And I think that's a happier space than trying to like meticulously like futz with an EQ. And so going back, it started with Outcast, and then over the years, it's been just a bunch of projects. I've been really lucky and very grateful for all the opportunities. But it's been like 25 years of doing really fun stuff, like the Halo Anniversary project. Star Wars: The Old Republic was really a blast.
I remember being happy when that got a lot of love at Gang one year, and it was clearly just such a gargantuan effort. And I remember thinking, in particular, you were someone I was very happy. I hadn't known, too far in advance that you were part of that mix, but I was so happy to discover that, because especially with Outcast as a bit of um, precursor of sorts. The funny thing is
Mhm.
that Outcast is not Star Warsy, but it
No, it's
shows
not.
a command over the orchestra that Star Wars absolutely requires as a
Yes.
baseline minimum.
Yeah.
And not just
For sure.
orchestration, but like that 19th century sensibility of this is a cast of characters that are used in certain ways. And you
Mhm.
know, this is not the Hans Zimmer thing where, yeah, okay, there are horns and there are strings and there are other elements, but
But no
it's not
woodwinds.
using them in the way, yeah, no winds, which are crucial to the traditional
Right.
sound. And so anyway, it was
Sure.
really cool because to
Yeah.
see, I remember doing a panel with Will Roget years ago where he was talking about how educational being around you was for him on that score, where he said,
Mhm.
he showed up to a session in Nashville or whatever, and he said that your cues were just, they read so much better than his, and he did not
Yes.
know why. And it was like it was a, oh God, what am I doing with my life? I apparently don't know this as well as I thought I did kind of experience for him. And I remember going, I believe that anybody in the room with Lenny would probably feel that way, especially if
Well,
it's
well,
early for them.
thank you. Yeah, and thank you, and thanks to Will for that kind thought. Yeah, you know what it is. It's just some of it is experiential. Like when you spend a lot of decades going through the pain of trying something and having it beat you up in the head, and going, yeah, that didn't work, and then you file that data point away.
Mm-hmm.
Then like later on, it's like you can show other people, which is why I like to contribute back to younger generations. It's you can show other people like that's not going to do what you think it's going to do, and then this is good, and it's not about being conservative in writing. I because as I mentioned early on, I was like doing graphic notation with big bands and stuff. So,
Oh, for sure.
like I like challenging players. I like seeing how far I can push their musicianship. Um, but at the same time, there's a very practical thing of like, this is what I'm going for, and we're gonna gun for it. And if I get 90% of the way there, I'm happy. It was a fun experiment. If it doesn't work, okay, and just kind of move on. But some of the playability of things is just really important in the way that I write and orchestrate. And sometimes it doesn't affect what you wrote as a composer, but it affects how you do the orchestra arrangements. If you notate something like, like an example that I recall from, it was Laura Cartman who had talked about EverQuest 2 she had done. And there was a rip up to a high C on the French horns. And she had basically, note by note, took a rip to a high C from a Stravinsky piece so that it was familiar pattern recognition for the
Yeah.
horn players, and they nailed it. And
Yeah.
and that idea is definitely something that I think about. It's presenting everything in a way that the musicians recognize right away, they can read it right away. And then also, like if you only have four percussionists, the timpani is just playing the timpani. Your mallet play, I usually split it like timpani, mallets, if I have mallets, and two auxiliaries, and I don't overshoot. I don't do overdubs. I just write for that. Um, so it's just, some of it is just that experiential knowledge, kind of touching back on that connection between Star Wars: The Old Republic and the sort of orchestral or compositional skill involved from Outcast. Is in Outcast, a lot of what I was doing was tone poems. All the
Mm.
exploration music was like 7 minutes long, and I was like thinking of, some people it's funny when people talk about what I was influenced by. One person did a review of that particular score and said it was influenced by Lord of the Rings, which is a film that hadn't come out for like 5 to 10 years
That
after
is
Outcast.
hilarious.
So and it always gives me a giggle. But
Maybe they meant the Leonard Rosenman animated Lord of the
could be,
Rings.
it could have been. That was, like I mentioned, I didn't really get into orchestral writing until after college. So once I started orchestrating for composers in Los Angeles, I started studying scores like crazy. And because I'm a crazy nut, I started with Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. And that was what I first drilled into. I just picked my favorite composers in orchestral music, and I picked the pieces that I loved. And then that sort of passion, I think, fueled my desire to like dig deep into all those things.
What I
And
love
so
about
that
Outcast in
foundation is
particular,
super important.
I couldn't agree more. And one of the things that I love is something that I think younger composers are increasingly struggling with,
Mhm.
because when you learn through sample libraries, you learn things that are deeply inhuman. Uh,
Yes.
and so, for example, one of the things that struck me so much back in 1999 um, was that at its most minimal and sort of so-called ambient, it's really not anything we would call ambient today. You think of, like you said, tone poems where
Yeah.
I think of like Sibelius, the
Mhm.
Finlandia or the Swan of
Right.
Tuonela, where it moves theoretically kind of slowly and there's a real transparency to it, but it's so musical. Everybody's doing something, even if
Yes.
it's seemingly in slow motion. And
Yeah.
and listening, I actually, because I was only able to play maybe 2.5 hours or so of the new Outcast, and I listened
Yeah.
to I kind of jumped around a lot, but I specifically wanted to go to those cues of the
Hmm.
new score to kind of hear where your brain was 25 years
Right.
later with that kind of stuff. And it's still so much that where I love is that
Yeah.
this is so-called exploration music, but
Yeah.
it's which is, a lot of people just hold a thing because the sample library will do that so effortlessly. And
Right.
but musicians hate that. It's actually really hard. It's not
Yeah.
it's not musical. It doesn't acknowledge that a body has to play this. And boy,
Right.
does your writing get that in spades. It's so nice to hear them play lines and the voicings on these chords, even if it's holding for 20 seconds, you can just feel that they all know their place. They're not sitting there going, what am I doing? Is this another one of these Spitfire just but now live kind
Right.
of things? It's so nice. It's so great.
Pianissimo kind of textural things. Yeah. And part of it is, part of that is, I think, and this also applied to the Star Wars foundational stuff. Like for me, Outcast and the Old Republic are very leitmotif focused,
Mm.
right? So it's about having themes and interweaving themes, and the whole original Outcast score was very much leitmotif approach, and so it's constantly developing ideas, and that's why the word exploration, also applied to what I was doing compositionally. I was exploring developing my ideas, developing thematic kind of components throughout, and weaving everything into a larger framework, and then seeing where things would go, and like not like being so restrictive in my approach, but just like a lot of times when I'm composing, I'm just playing. I'm a 7-year-old at a piano, and just I've got ideas in my head, and I hear it in my head, and then I just am writing, and that's I like that freedom when I'm originally creating, and then after I feel satisfied with how I'm developing a piece, later I'll listen to it again and then critique it and then get more analytical about it. But both those two projects were very much leitmotif kind of approach to things, understanding the vocabulary of orchestral music, and like the only distinction between Outcast and the Old Republic was Old Republic. It's the sandbox of language that John Williams founded, and that sandbox includes things like octatonic scales and all these sort of musical elements. The instrumentation was important, but also the touches of like how somebody like Williams would approach scoring something. And the thing that we had as a directive on that project from Jesse Harlan was really that he didn't want us to be John Williams or to impersonate him. He just wanted us to play in the sandbox and do our own thing.
Yeah.
So to me, like me and Mark Brisky, the principal composer, and then Gordy Hab were like very much having phone conversations for hours about what is that sandbox. And to me, that's the most fun in those sort of collaborative projects with multiple composers is those kinds of conversations. But it was definitely leitmotif. Williams has a thing. If I describe it in a nutshell, it's usually like 4 things going on. Usually you're only allowed 3. If you're Gary Goldsmith, something up high, something in the middle, something down low. But if you're Williams, it's basically a good theme, great accompaniment, might be a cool bass line that's, kind of he's playing with, and then what I call ear candy.
Yeah,
So,
right. All the
his
flourishes
flourishes and things like that. So, and then his sense of melodic rhythm and those kinds of things. But you can take those bones and be yourself within those bones. So that's part of what's going on with all that. But jumping forward, because you mentioned Outcast: A New Beginning, sequel. That's been so much fun. It's been like 4 to 5 years of development. And I basically created the score, but also all the music implementation, the music design for how everything works. So when you talked about the exploration music, I went with what was not possible in 1999. In 1999, it was Redbook audio, like a music CD. And you could, on the Redbook audio, you could put little index points on the audio tracks. So you could potentially skip around and fade into something. But it was this trick of loading certain things like sound design elements onto a hard drive. And then the music CD would take like a quarter of a second to change tracks.
Yep.
So
but I remember it was actually revelatory. I remember you did something that was so elegantly simple that is still pretty rare, where you would write these like 7-minute long pieces where you would rely, I often refer to it as a dark secret of interactive game music, that sometimes you can create this impression of interactivity by making something that's long and kind of internally eclectic and diverse enough that it will randomly bump up against noteworthy moments in the game where the player will just project agency or intentionality. And it's like, it's one of those odd where I'll write something that's obsessively granular and our wide sessions look absolutely bananas. And I will just, because I love that. So I live for the interactive music. And then every now and again I'll go, or what if it's just, we take a page from Outcast? I always think of Outcast. What if it's a 5-minute piece that just kind of is, but it's trying to be kind of interesting in its own right, so that it all kind of somehow magically comes together. So that was, I wanted to call that out because well, at the time I imagine it was a sort of, necessity is the mother of invention, but I wanted to ask
it was honestly a happy accident.
That's
because
so funny.
I just wrote dynamic music. So I made sure, I thought exploration music, let's not go too big, but it was like, piano to maybe mezzo forte at the most as far as dynamic changes. So, but basically it's developing your compositional ideas and telling a story, that is sort of like there in the background. And then occasionally somebody looks up at the two moons and it happens to be a big crescendo moment, and they're like, how did you do that?
Yeah, exactly. And what they don't realize is that instead, if they had been looking at a tree stump when that crescendo happens, they wouldn't have registered something like it's because they were excited by the two moons that in the music. So that, and those things, if you play long enough, those things will happen because it's just a law of averages at that point. And it's a really wonderfully pragmatic way of approaching things.
Yeah. And there's this thing, especially with music design, because you and I are both wise nerds as far as, interactive music systems and like trying to figure out how that puzzle can get solved. And there's a way you can get so granular that you kind of lose track of your story. What's the story I want to tell musically? How do I support the project? And it's fun to go granular, but at the same point, it's like you were saying, sometimes it's like to be able to catch yourself like you did and kind of go, no, wait, what if we tried this, and just see how it plays. And, and so, kind of to point to in Outcast: A New Beginning, what kinds of things I did that were things I was experimenting with on this sort of music design front. I got what we typically get, where the client goes, we're in the forest, we need 5 minutes of forest music.
Yeah.
And part of it is, it was driven by my sensibilities as a gamer, as somebody that loves playing games. And one of the things and a lot of it has to do with the things I really hate. So if I walk into a village and it's the same piece of village music every time, and it's always, if I'm only in the village for 10 seconds. Yeah. So if I'm only in the village for 10 seconds, I'm hearing the first 10 seconds of the same piece of music. I hate that. So what I did was I took they said, hey, we need 5 minutes of village music or 5 minutes of forest music. And I said, okay, I'm going to take that 5 minutes and break it into 3 pieces, and like an A, B, and a C piece. And the end of the A piece will work perfectly with connected to the beginning of the B or the C. And so
Right.
I've worked out all the parameters. So compositionally, I just make sure that the beginnings and the ends of these 1.5 to 2 minute pieces make sense storytelling wise. And so, I am writing 5 minutes of material. It's all developed thematic material for that particular area. But when I get into whys, I basically roll the dice.
Yeah.
And so every time you go in the village, it's going to be A, B, or C. And it could go. And so it's playing with form a lot, which I think is a lot of fun. The pieces still have an extended feel to them. And the stuff I do in the A or the B or the C piece, it's not the same thing. It's basically, I may state a full version of my melody in one of those, but I'm just developing material that's based on whatever my original melody is. And that makes it so much fun as a player in playtesting that. It was like just one of many things that I was doing just on a horizontal level of, how things were procedurally working, to make it interesting and not have that thing. Every time I'm in a particular combat situation, it's the same music start. I wanted to keep it really interesting and vary it up as much as possible. And I did the same thing vertically. So like, as an example, our friend Tina Gua was playing some cello melodies on that score. And I just said, give me 4 variations of this melody, do whatever you like, and like, so she could just do a very nuanced interpretation, or she could show how fast she can play something, and it was, and
Which
she's
for her is scary.
incredibly, yeah, it's very scary, but it would make me giggle when I would hear the tracks back and stuff like that. And then I would run the randomizer on whenever it reached a particular moment where there would be a Tina melody moment, it would roll the dice and pick one of them. And I did that with everybody who did solo material. And
how much
one
music?
Of those things.
Because even with one of the things that what you're describing gains is that a comparatively small amount of material can go very far without just feeling like you're beating it to death. Nonetheless, it did feel like you wrote quite a lot of music despite that. So it's like you're kind of really maximizing it at that point. So what was the actual, because it really felt like I couldn't actually get a handle around how much was in there.
Okay, then we did our job properly. No, it was 136 minutes of music was what they had asked for. And that was all in-game kind of material. And for the cinematics, the other thing about the system is it's a modular system because of all those vertical components and all the horizontal components.
Right.
So I could easily score a scene for a cinematic or cutscene, where I could just say, I just need the high strings on, I also recorded the orchestra in pieces. So it was like high strings, low strings, brass.
Okay, that was going to be my next question, is because obviously if you're doing the original game, very tutti, even including choir, your ability to do that is almost non-existent. But this time you did not. You recorded everything in a much more structured way, you're saying?
Yeah, and part of it was the necessity of COVID kind of kicked in high gear right around that time, so it was hard to find an orchestra. Doing the soloist was easy.
Right, sure.
Yeah, it was right at the beginning of that. So, 2020 or something like that. 2020, 2021 was about when we were recording everything. So we spent about 2 months recording. So I just split, what was safe for everybody. We were recording in Sofia, Bulgaria, and violins, violas in one session, cellos and basses in another session. Brass, orchestral percussion was a separate session. And then woodwinds, harp, piano were in a session. Choir was a separate session. We did 2 months of recording. And then on top of that, all the soloists were just recording in their home studios. MB Gordy did a ton of like solo percussion, along with Mark Risky did some. So I brought Mark in to play percussion. Because Mark's
I don't think I knew that he was a
major.
percussionist. Yeah, I don't think I knew that. That's great.
Yeah, and then my friend Chris Garcia, who tours with the grandmothers, which would be Frank Zappa's mothers, and he tours with a bunch of people. He's a wonderful percussionist and drummer who focuses on Mesoamerican instruments, as well as like East Indian kinds of like tabla playing is amazing and stuff like that. So yeah, between all those folks, had a lot of fun percussion components that were all separated from the orchestra, that I kind of play around with. And so hopefully that answered your question. I don't
Yeah,
know if
it's great. I was able to play it enough and listen enough to get a sense of a pretty large labyrinth of systems, but I wasn't able to play enough to feel like I had kind of clocked how it's all working. And so it's great to kind of get a sense of knowing you had that level of granular control, because I had just kind of assumed you recorded it like the original, if only out of
necessity,
nostalgia. Yeah.
Right.
Well,
yeah,
because like for example, I did this trilogy of games, the Banner Saga, where the first game we did in a concert hall with a non-session group. It was a sitting orchestra that rehearsed together, play together, and never really play to a click. So I said, well, let's lean into that. And I wrote a whole score, including interactive music systems, that did not require that. And so then the second and third games, I was able to record sort of the traditional way. But I said, you know what? I kind of like that it forced me down a novel path to lean into the restrictions of the first one. So even the third one, we were doing it air. But I was like, I kind of want to record this like we did the first one, because it sort of somehow feels like the Banner Saga to me at this point. And so that's why I was curious if there was a sense of a similar Outcast is done one way, because the writing is certainly on a baseline compositional level very consistent with the original in that way. But the production sounds like it's actually you were able to really use all the toys that we have that wouldn't have been available at the time of the first.
Yeah, I think one of the things, I knew I was going to have soloists, so that was going to be separate, and I knew I had that kind of isolation. I think originally, before COVID kicked into high gear, I might have thought of doing it, with everybody together. And when I was getting bids for orchestras around the world, like I just had to pick places that, like New Zealand was a consideration, because they kicked butt on their COVID management, and so a couple of places in Europe, and then the publisher, I just gave them some budget options, which is something for the emerging composers, always give options. And then they picked what they felt most comfortable doing and what they were into doing, and then so part of it was, it originally thought maybe we'll do everything together, but then once COVID hit and it seemed like the only way I could do it was in components, that made the most sense of doing something more adaptive and more interactive, was because I had the orchestra split into 4 or 5 components. I could mix and match things, and then that becomes a puzzle on the orchestration side. Because, like if I was orchestrating full orchestra 2D, I could make my orchestrations a little lighter and scale things very quiet and just more minimalized at times. But, with everything on separate stems, what you have to do is you have to think, well, there's in whatever group I'm recording, there has to be something going on the audio track for the player to feel like something shifted. And you can still make very elegant choices, but it's going to sound like a little more full, a little more doubled kind of an orchestration approach. And as long as you know that that's what's going on technically, so like for instance, the woodwinds, harp, and piano were playing together, so there doesn't have to be woodwinds throughout the whole piece. I could just have a harp thing in the beginning, woodwinds in the middle, a little piano thing at the end, and over the course of that 1.5, 2 minutes, I got what I need to support the whole thing. And that, so that was an element in the thinking. It's just, sometimes the necessity of the situation dictated.
I mean, on some level, it's always gonna, but in this case, in pretty seriously significant ways. Which is exciting and nice.
Yeah, and this is so much fun to kind of like it, because I'm a big fan of puzzles and solving puzzles. Like it's just fun for me to find a solution. And it's really satisfying.
It certainly seems that you did.
Yeah.
It's so cool to see something like that circle back and the opportunity to revisit it. And I love that
weird. Yeah.
Well, who would have guessed,
it's like nobody, I don't think in the history of games has there been something that long apart, like 25 years,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
from
well,
the
worth
first
the wait.
game to the follow up. Definitely worth the wait, and worth it for me because Outcast as a project was like near and dear to my heart. And even though, just like most parents, you don't have a favorite child, you know, that part is like a
No,
thing.
but everybody
But
remembers the first time they
yeah.
fell in love, and
Oh, sure.
if it's the thing that was represented your entry point into games, then
Yes,
it
definitely.
doesn't have to be the favorite child to hold a very specific place in your heart.
Yeah. Yeah, you can have lots of little special places and stuff like that, which is, great part of it. And to be able to dive into that material again was a big joy, and to develop new themes and new material, and then just kind of, there were certain things that I kept as far as strategy, like the original game, the modality, the main tonality that I utilize. Is also in Outcast: A New Beginning. The sort of way I modulate and move from one modality to another, those strategies are very much the same,
It felt
and that
consistent.
creates some continuity that way.
Yeah,
Because
no,
I
that
felt,
comes through very
it's with
immediately.
franchise stuff, you want to look for threads of continuity. You want to look for things that kind of connect things together in the same way,
You'd
like what Star
think
Wars:
that
The
would
Old
be
Republic.
commonplace, but that's why I love that. Hopefully, there was no question about uh, you returning for the sequel, because even that sometimes is not a given. Like sometimes
Yeah,
it's that people just go, oh well, like we see things differently now, or this or that or the other, and I'm like,
right.
but do these things not matter, or is loyalty kind of is that overrated? I don't think so
Yeah,
personally. It made me
yeah,
happy to see you just appear, and I
yeah,
just if nothing else,
yeah.
my head canon says, of course, there was only no consideration otherwise. So it
Yeah,
was nice because
and it made me happy too. And part of it is I've been friends with these developers for ever, and so we had discussions early on about bringing me on, and then it was just about solidifying things like you know what's the scope of what we want to accomplish together in all of that. So I don't even think there was any sort of a
hesitation.
auditioning
Yeah,
or hesitation. Is like so it was a very unique kind of situation. I think there's certain franchises where that is a little looser. Example, with Call of Duty, you got 3 different developers.
oh yeah, no,
So
that's different because that's almost different franchise. I mean, like I've worked on one of
yeah,
the Assassin's Creeds, for
yeah,
example, but under no
sure,
circumstance did I just assume that like I was the go-to person for that franchise now. That
right,
each one was treated. I mean, even that there's different studios within Ubisoft that
yeah,
Montreal will be the lead on this one. Quebec City will be the lead on this one. That moves
sure,
around leadership and creative directors and all that kind of thing internally, even if it is all just a Ubisoft game. So
yeah.
that's
And now we're
different.
getting back to business stuff again.
Yeah, indeed,
you know,
indeed. Well, yeah, that's actually, I
It's like a
really
little-
love that you said, don't think of it as adversarial. It's
yes,
almost like what I will, when I invariably have to think of a title for this, when downstream, I reshare these on my own YouTube channel, and I love that business is not adversarial. That will be my punchline,
yes,
because I do think that it is easy, especially for younger, inexperienced folks, to just think, oh, your job is to sort of hold the line against their greed. And I go, maybe occasionally, but generally speaking,
yeah,
everyone that I've worked with we're all trying to do the best that we can. And
sure,
different people have different incentives and different
right, or
people that they
priorities,
need
yeah,
to satisfy, or different priorities and different constraints. And they're also they have a different field of view. And that changes your perception, and it's just the more you learn about that, the more you can empathize with where they're coming from. Even if it
yeah,
makes for tough conversations, at least you understand they're not out there because they hate you or something. They wouldn't even be
yeah.
wanting to hire you if that was the case.
Yeah, totally. And along that line, um, to me, a really important component of that is what I try and do is I try and think to myself, and it's hard for a lot of composers to do this because we are in our little bubble. We're in our little studios and we're doing our work. I just try and think of what does their day look like. So it is curiosity that sort of rules everything. It's like, oh, what is this film producer? What does his day look like? Oh, he's like doing 500 phone calls a day and he's all stressed out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make him feel like, hey man, music is handled. Everything's cool. And
yeah, exactly. Be the thing that de-stresses them.
Yeah, totally. So we could just have a fun 5-minute conversation. Or if I do have questions for a director or for a game developer, what I try and do is I just try and like collect them and not like it was a giant list. It's not going to be a tome. It's just going to be like, I got about 5 to 10 questions on a bunch of different things. Let me know when you have time to kind of address them. And then we'll get together and we'll sort this stuff out. And I find that for people that are super crazy, like scattered and busy because of the nature of what their day looks like, it's a relief for them to go, oh, I spent 10 minutes answering these 10 questions and the composer knows what they got to do now, And so that's part, like of just being curious about the other side of the table. This also applies to contracts and like, what is it that they are, in a negotiation, what is it that is important to them? And some of it's control of intellectual property. Some of it's other stuff. Some of it is like a fear of a liability or those kinds of things. And to me, it's like from my, in the negotiating thing, it's just being mindful of that stuff and trying to, on my end, have a win-win kind of a contract where we both feel on both sides that that's a pretty fair agreement. And if we're there, it may not be perfect. It never is. But if it feels fair on both sides, then job well done. Move on. Bang out the score. Indeed. Get it done. Yep. Have a good time.
I love all this, and it really echoes. I didn't really drive the point home as much, but you were teaching at USC when I went, and when when I was able to go, get my career kind of off the ground. Thereafter, a lot of what you talked about in our class really was very formative, and so I love that a lot of that is sort of making its way into this conversation because it was immensely helpful compositionally, career, philosophy wise, et cetera. That said, because you have experience with that and you've met a lot of composers over the years that are kind of just starting, and you've probably seen a lot of recurring mistakes or a lot of recurring mindsets that might benefit from adjusting. I just figured as a note to end on, if you had, I don't think I've ever really ended one of these this way, but as somebody who was so useful to me, I was just curious as a kind of outward, as a way to take us out, if you had any sort of singular advice for the younger composers or younger anyone. I mean, obviously this is a podcast that's listened to by anyone interested in game development in general, so it doesn't necessarily have to be restricted to composers, but you're somebody who makes such a strong impression as being the kind of person who has put a lot of thought into all the things that matter to you. It's not just impulsive, off the cuff kind of personality type. And so I just, broadly, a pearl of wisdom that you think would benefit folks who might be listening.
Okay. So there's a particular item that sticks out in a big way in my mind, which is that, you're not alone. And in the same way that I provided some guidance and mentorship for you, Austin, you are doing in your podcasts that you do and the way you communicate and share information, you're doing the same thing. You're letting other people know, hey, this has been my experience. This is a shared experience. And, in the same way, we're going to flash back to me being a 16-year-old kid thinking I was a weirdo and going to this music camp and realizing, there's a collection of us and we're all hanging out together and we're all making things. And so part of it is that it's just that you're not alone component applies to everything. It's like, biggest composers for film in the world, Zimmer doesn't do it all by himself. He's got a whole team, and James
An
Newton
army.
Howard, everybody has like, a bunch of help of people that are really good at different aspects to help us do what we got to do, even though our name might be, as the lead composer. And so, sharing information and challenging each other to keep raising the bar on the art form, to me is like part of it. And like, I can't do that by myself. I can't raise the bar of the quality of game audio forever, but it's something I'm really passionate about. And I just challenge everybody to take that on. It's just like, it doesn't matter how weird the idea is, just try it out, see if it works, proof of concept, get it going, see if your nutty idea like makes the game better, makes the film better, or whatever, or makes your album better. And just, to me, that you're not alone component is a big deal. And it's something that is deeply personal for me. That recognition of that as a young man, and then the commitment that I have to contribute to future generations. That all is all part of that one kind of component.
Yeah, well, that's a fantastic answer, and I will happily give a shout out to your big band record, which is very aptly one after another. You're paying homage to your own mentors and inspirations, and the very fact that the album is literally titled that reminded me of the Virgil Thompson piece Portraits, where each movement is a person who really impacted his life. It was a beautiful sentiment for you to bring to the record, and incredibly on brand with what you just said.
Yeah, totally. And that was something I'd been thinking a lot about when I originally came up with the concept for that album. And it's called Mentors. It's easy to find. Just look up my website, and there's a link to everything there. The thing about it is, like, those people, when you think about those mentors, there is a diaspora of a lot of stuff. So we're talking, Michael Gibbs was composer in residence at Berklee, and Michael he pulled me away from being so theoretical and being more intuitive in the way I thought about what was important in music, and blending my theoretical knowledge with what my heart says is the right thing to do. Arif Mardin, legendary record producer. We're talking Aretha Franklin, Chaka Khan, all these great artists, and his ability to find the magic in every artist and really make it pop out in the mix, and his arranging ability and all that kind of stuff. So there's all these different people. Toshiko Akiyoshi is in there. Weather Report, Steps Ahead, these jazz, influential jazz bands from the 70s and 80s that were formative in my aesthetics about, like, just jazz in general. So it's just and then some of them are my friends, like Nick Manson and Andy Suzuki. There's a track that's dedicated to them. And we were in high school playing in Nick's shack in the back of his home, and playing a lot of jazz together as teenagers. And we've known each other our whole lives. And so there's all those really important kinds of connections, but they're all over the place. So it's like record producers and teachers, educators. And some of them are people I never met. Don Grolnick, who's one of the great jazz composers, pianists, and just like amazing writing and stuff like that. So it's just like all these different people. That's been all part of it. So it's just trying to pass that stuff down.
Well, mission accomplished. I love it. Thank you so much, man. Really appreciate you making the time for this.
Awesome. Thank you so much, man. It's so good to see you. I know we've been trying to get a hang going at some point, but we will make it happen for sure.
Yes, we shall. This was a good,
we'll talk about Jerry Goldsmith
short
more.
Circuit in the meantime. Oh, hell yeah. There's a can of worms.
Right.
Thanks, man.
Totally.